To give you a sense of having gone back into this original architecture, Alfred Mansfeld wrote about creating these cool form-cast concrete cubes with a floating roof slab, a clear story of light bathing the warm, modest archaeology of ancient Israel. We're not in Egypt. This is not gold inlay with lapis. This is pottery and stone. And to see how warm this becomes when we strip back to that, we made our own fancy glass. We're very proud of this glass. 200,000 foot candles outside is now 80 within. And you have this sense of what he hoped to achieve in 1965, allowing us to feel that our job has been about realizing that vision. The beginning of that narrative is 1.5 million years ago. I'm pleased and proud to say the end of that narrative of the archaeology of the ancient land is an expression of the migration of Islamic culture east to Persia, its own kind of diaspora, here with a really fantastic 17th century prayer niche, a mihrab from Isfahan. Entering Jewish art and life, again, signage does nothing, although we have it everywhere, but the idea that this is an expression of the cycle of life. Our concept here is to mix. Our concept is that we're not about sacred, secular, Western, Oriental. It is that we are about all those cultures merged together. So the treatment of these galleries is a whole sense of the experience of the cycle of the Jewish year through the holidays of the Jewish year, which you see expressed here, and then separately a kind of synagogue street. We're fortunate to have synagogues, two from European venues in the 18th and 19th century, one from southern India in the 16th to 18th century, and new because the director of the museum is American, from the Americas, one of the first synagogues built in the Americas, transported from Holland at the end of the 17th century, this interior being from Suriname at the beginning of the 18th century. In the fine art galleries in Western cultures, of course, we're in Israel, so we begin in Israel with the 100 Years of Art in Israel, which is the history of that tradition. But if you follow that path back, it leads you almost 4 galleries later to a point where you meet up with Europe in the 19th century, allowing us to bring a kind of conjoining, because again, for us, this is about a continuous narrative, so we want that meeting point to occur. In our modern galleries, I hope Alfred Barr is smiling kindly on us, because we feel that we have tried to bring back that aesthetic sense of how you show the important masterworks of the early 20th century in a museum setting. Our non-Western cultures collections are surprisingly strong in pre-Columbia, Africa, Oceania, and Asia. For where we are and the youthfulness of the museum, we have incredibly rich collections. Of course, for our purposes, we've aligned them with the modern gallery so that we have opportunities to create these very nice peekaboos so that you can look through an African throne chair. You see Picasso and Max Ernst, half of an African horned mask, the other half of the pair being on the wall just there, so that even if you don't know very much about art history, subliminally you are picking up these messages of connections as you move. The entire top level of the museum, if we've been through 200,000 feet below, we're now going through 20,000 feet, or 10% of all the galleries of the museum devoted to contemporary art. So what used to be the main entrance is now a place to pay homage to the original engineering of Al Mansfeld's modernism in the 1960s, and it becomes a way into contemporary art as a separate experience, or a way to join contemporary art if you come up from below as part of the unified experience. Here you see an installation where, again, subliminally, we are trying to suggest artists from one part of the world, like Mircea Cantor from Bulgaria to Paris, or Eva Rothschild from Ireland to England, so that you're seeing this sense of integration and cross-culturalism, which is what we're about. Here you're also seeing a kind of amazing, one could give a long lecture about this 21-foot-high boy from South Tel Aviv by an Israeli artist called Ohad Maromi, who is of Western European heritage, but is here reflecting on the challenges of the subculture of Ethiopians in Israel, with an amazing piece made of styrofoam wrapped in black construction paper. So any one of you could give a great talk about this as it compares with Michelangelo's David. Just to look for a moment at the character of our contemporary floor. Here, Peter Coffin. here coming out from that experience to Anish Kapoor's Turning the World Upside Down, Jerusalem, and simply exiting and having a sense of the integration of the campus as it is now. If one knew it in 1965 or saw images of it, what you see now is the kind of unfolding of that, and always a subliminal notion of unfolding and of connection from 1.5 million years ago to the present. And again, coming back to this remarkable view, which is in everyone's mind from the first moment of what the place is about, even though now it's completely reinvented. Very quickly, just to show you some temporary exhibitions from the past 6 months, because one of our questions is actually about where contemporary fits in a larger picture. So this is Roman glass from 1st century AD, being the first glass signed by the glassmaker, William Kentridge. We were the last exhibition on the world tour of his career retrospective of Michal Ullman, very important Israeli sculptor, again showing the character of the contemporary spaces. Christian Marclay's clock. We are fortunate to be one of those who were able to acquire this work, as are others who are in this room. An exhibition just closing of recent acquisitions in contemporary art. An exhibition of the LA-based video artist Sharon Lockhart, working with the history of the Israeli choreographer and tapestry designer Noah Eshkol, a project that we've done with our colleagues at the LA County Museum, where this show opens next month. A contemporary design exhibition, and then a focus exhibition on an important masterwork, our 1614 Rubens' Death of Adonis, surrounded by collateral objects borrowed from a great many friends in the museum world, as a kind of vignette of art history in an important setting, in an important place. Now, what is all of that about? All of that is simply to show you, in a place that's so far from everywhere else, how you can have this kind of synthesis. We finished this 1.5 years ago. 1 million people came in the first 12 months. We're not such a big city and not such a big country. That's sort of remarkable. There's been a lot of embracing of what we've done. There's been a lot of appreciation for contextualizing Israel in the scheme of world culture and not the opposite. And really a lot of appreciation for the idea that reinvention or renewal is the answer rather than starting from scratch. So, sorry to have taken more time, but I felt that having this perhaps with us really gives context to the questions that we all want to consider together. Thank you.
That was so interesting. I don't know if my mic is on. Is it okay? All right. It's a bit Monty Python, and now for something completely different. Because, as we all know, we all hear really what we want to hear, despite whatever anyone is actually saying to us. And so what I continually heard in the lead up to this conversation between myself and James was a series of questions put forward by the board of the AAMC as they were trying to fashion this morning's program about questions that to my ear betrayed the ongoing and I think not unfamiliar anxiety about the role of contemporary art in the General Museum, and I think James's presentation touched on some of that, although he seems to have been doing a successful job at downplaying the tension and striving towards success. But I'm going to quickly read something I wrote that's been on my mind now for a while about this problem of the contemporary. And I hope it isn't too polemical, but here we go. My job here this morning is to interview James Snyder, the director of the Israel Museum of Art, and the general parameters of our discussion will be the role of the contemporary or contemporary art in a general or encyclopedic museum. I believe I've been asked to do this since I've worked in both types of institutions. The Baltimore Museum of Art and the Harvard Art Museums are both encyclopedic in nature. and the Wexner Center for the Arts and the ICA Boston are both contemporary art museums. But rather than enumerating the trials and tribulations of the role of contemporary art or the role of the contemporary curator in those jobs, I thought I would begin with a very brief historical framing of the problem as I see it. For one way of looking at the situation is to say, if we truly believe in contemporary art, then its role would perhaps not be so vexing. We would behave as we usually behave. We would acquire, display, and research the art of our time with the same art historical methodologies and museum practices that we have been using since the birth of the modern museum, which, again, for me is sort of like the Louvre at the French Revolution. But clearly, narratives of rupture and crisis have plagued contemporary art and the museum for most of the 20th century. Such narratives formed the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1929, where James used to work, and the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston in 1936, where I currently work. Each of those institutions was formed out of the growing frustrations of a handful of people that the art of their time was not being adequately exhibited at institutions such as the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the MFA Boston, and the Fogg across the river in Cambridge. The Cubist fracturing of the picture plane, the development of the Duchampian ready-made, and the rise of photography were seen by some as a break too radical to be properly assimilated into the grand tradition of art historical progress and nationalist pride that had been the dominant ideologies that guided the installation of art in encyclopedic museums. Indeed, the break with pictorial conventions signaled by Cubism, the ready-made, and the photograph refused to uphold narratives of art's progress, narratives rooted in a version of history that believes in the progressive betterment of society as indicated by increasingly refined displays of the aesthetic, or so the Kantians and Hegelians among us would have it, and they are indeed among us. But there wasn't only the split between the contemporary and the general, there was also the split between MoMA and the ICA Boston, and I find it to be an instructive one. MoMA organized itself as a collecting institution and set about dogmatically offering the history of the 20th century. In other words, it borrowed wholesale the logic of the encyclopedic museum in terms of collecting and display. The ICA established itself, and many ICAs in the wake of the ICA Boston, established itself as a Kunsthalle, committed to exhibitions of the new, refusing to collect as a means to remain limber, ready to address the new without the deep ballast of tradition. And this choice was in part, I believe, particular to the city of the ICA's birth, a city as hidebound and tradition-philic as any I know in this country. It's okay to laugh at that. I'm a native New Yorker taking a jab at Boston. Both strategies, however, have real merits. Nimbleness remains one of the great virtues of contemporary art museums. This virtue is most clearly evidenced in their reaction time. Committed to the new, they are free to show the new as it emerges, with varying degrees of suspended judgment, made possible by the fact that they don't have to contemplate caring for it for centuries to come. MoMA in its early days, too, was quite nimble. But as the collection developed and the art historical narratives of Alfred Barr, who I also am a perverse fan of, and Clement Greenberg took increasing hold, some of that nimbleness was lost. The Harlem Renaissance was neglected, surrealism was treated with a kind of suspicion, the grand experiments of the Soviets avoided, feminism was ignored, and the growing body of work by artists of color in the 1970s was nowhere to be found. But what contemporary institutions gained from nimbleness, they lost in terms of history. The exhibition-only model lent itself to a kind of Groundhog Day effect. With each new artist and each new movement, contemporary museums are still asked to answer the plaintive question, but is it art? Divorced from art's long arc of history, the new is asked to prove itself again and again. Now, to my way of thinking, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, established in the 1970s, was able to offer a way out of this paradigm. It set out both to collect and be exhibition-driven. And most importantly, it decided to put artists at the center of its mission, which I actually think is quite different from putting art at the center of your mission. Because I think when you put artists at the center of your mission, your primary institutional question becomes, how do I, as the curator, treat this object in a way that will respect, honor, and convey the artist's greatest aspirations for it? I think this allowed L.A. MoCA to embark upon an extraordinary program of exhibitions dedicated to telling the history of the present. And I'm thinking of their shows on minimalism, conceptual art, performance art, feminism, and most recently, land art. These exhibitions were all big, messy, complicated, and riven with internal contradictions. But I also found them very bold and quite brave. Taken as a whole, they argued that the role of the museum is to situate art within its socio-historical frameworks as a way of connecting it to the daily lives of the audiences who come to see it. They argued, in other words, that the contemporary is not only new per se, but that contemporary formations have histories, rules, and principles, and that it is the job of the museum to both explicate and engender those histories, rules, and principles. Given this extremely potted history of the problem of contemporary art in the General Museum and the problem of the Contemporary Museum divorced from the encyclopedic one, I would like to close my remarks with what may to some sound as a plea and to others as a polemic. I'm sure, in truth, it is both. Pardon me. I fear the current crisis of contemporary art in the museum is due to a profound abdication on the part of all art museums to their founding discipline, art history. As a discipline, art history has always had a bifurcated existence, half residing in the academy and half due to the uniqueness of its objects of study needing to be displayed, residing in the museum. Each of us in this audience knows all too well the historical and present antipathy between our brothers and sisters in the academy and us curators. I sigh silently in my head even to mention that madness out loud here this morning. But I truly believe that the tension between these two sides of the art historical coin has led us to the almost century-long problem we face. What is contemporary about contemporary art does not reside in the object per se, with all of their inherent vice when it comes to conservation and their slippery refusals to fit into the neat housekeeping categories of the museum. But rather, the ideas that went into making it is where I think the contemporary lies. The collective ideas of a period that have shaped a works of art horizons of possibility. Needless to say, curators of ancient art working today are as shaped by those conditions as are contemporary artists, which is why the first gallery of ancient art that James showed was so poignant. So too, contemporary artists are some of the most highly trained artists of all time. They come to their respective practices after years of schooling in which the long history of objects and ideas has been unfurled before them in a smorgasbord of almost hedonistic proportions. So my plea is as follows. Can we as curators please readhere ourselves as a professional field to the discipline of art history? Can the non-contemporary experts reimagine the installation of their galleries in a contemporary way? Can they take to heart the great challenges laid at the feet of the idea of art, capital A, scare quotes, anything you want to do to set it off, by artists, philosophers, and art historians of the last 50 years? Can they begin to forego the idea of the masterpiece and their belief in historical progress? Can they challenge the transhistorical dimension of art? Can they acknowledge that, as George Kubler said in his brilliant little book, The Shape of Time, that art historians are like astronomers. Both are concerned with things seen in the present that happened a very, very long time ago. And likewise, can contemporary curators also readhere themselves to the discipline of art history and forego the idea that the new is, in and of itself, a virtue? Indeed, can they abandon the idea that history either doesn't exist or doesn't matter? Can we treat our objects of contemplation and study with the same historical rigor that is typically reserved for older art? For instance, It's my assumption that no self-respecting curator of French painting would write a wall label about Jacques-Louis David without mentioning the French Revolution. Why then do we almost never encounter the mention of the Vietnam War in galleries dedicated to 60s and 70s art? How is it that nearly a decade of multiple wars waged by this country, dare I say unprovoked, goes routinely unmentioned in most contemporary museums? Might the general public's confusion regarding the transubstantiation of plumbing fixtures into sculptures be the fault of a museum culture unwilling, or can it be that we are unable, to explain the ready-made? In other words, to put it as plainly as I can, I am suggesting that the general museum has to open itself up to the methodologies of the present, to not fear them, to not eschew them, to not assume that they are wrong, and that the contemporary must commit itself to the history of forms and ideas. The historical realm of expertise in which such problems has been articulated and resolved has traditionally been the discipline of art history. Can we reconnect our institutions to it and begin our work anew? How about now? Yes? Thank you.
Is mine? Yes.
So now I thought we'd move to the Dick Cavett portion of the program, in which I will play Dick Cavett, even though you look a little more like Dick Cavett than I do. And I thought I would ask you some questions. And I guess the first question I want to ask you, especially given your presentation, which makes me just want to go to Jerusalem immediately, is do you think that contemporary art behaves differently in the galleries than the other art that you have displayed?
You know, it's really interesting. Everything you said just sparked my thinking about when I first went to Jerusalem. I was well trained, but somehow, in my thinking, everything was about what happened in 1850 that allowed the trajectory of modernism and then contemporary art to occur. I don't know why I never turned around and looked the other way. And I arrived in Jerusalem, and I turned around and I saw 1.5 million years of incredible stuff.
Right.
And that was all about contemporaneity. And I thought, in my own MoMA life, I just missed Alfred Barr by 3 months.
Oh.
Actually, I saw him, but he was on his way out. And
It's
and
the
I
closest
realized,
I've ever gotten, sitting next to you, who has seen Alfred Barr.
And I realized that's what he thought about, but somehow it left. And here I was being given the opportunity to have this moment of enlightenment in a setting where really 10% of our place is devoted to contemporary art, on its own but in context.
Right.
And I spoke of this 5 years before we actually embarked on rethinking the notion of universalism in a fully connected setting, start to finish. And we used that time not to make sort of superficial juxtapositions of works of art that are new with things that are old, but really looking at the aesthetic and the meaning of things that are new and of things that are old, and understanding how they worked together when you put them together. That was a premise of rethinking, addressing contemporary in an historical and prehistorical setting. And it proved out in a lot of ways. The first is that if you decide that you have a backdrop, that your aesthetic for display is not always the same, but maintains a continuous standard, then this seems simple-minded in a way, but it's quite a critical point. If you also decide that you're going to look at objects regardless of where they fall in history and where they came from in the world, but giving them the opportunity to carry their place in their history with them, if you display them so that they can radiate that meaning, you can juxtapose objects and you can absorb appreciation from them, and it's not tension. And in the course of remaking our museum, it's a funny thing, we grew to 200, we doubled, we added 100,000 feet of collection galleries, we reduced by 30% the number of objects in those spaces. And it sounds, again, quite simple, but when you do that and you allow an object, you look at each object for the radiance that it makes in terms of what it looks like and what it means, it minimizes tension across history and it allows you to put objects together. You know,
And can I interrupt you for a second? So in terms of thinking about history or art history as a discipline, was it a conscious decision on your part to minimize tension, to create this idea of a kind of universal? Did you ever, or did that just come about, or did you ever think, did you ever play with the other side? Like, what if we actually highlighted breaks, ruptures, tensions, and what kind of history does that offer?
You know, it's interesting because there's tension and there's tension. I mean, you can
And then
look,
there's tension.
You can think about, we avoid the third. You can think about historical or visual tension, but you can make display that doesn't read that tension, but allows you to illuminate it, to understand it. And actually, we focus on that. And it's a funny thing, you know, I only showed those images at the end of recent exhibitions because I counted up in the last 8 months, 6 out of 8 exhibitions in the museum were contemporary. And here we're in a very traditional place. We're in a very sort of history-anchored place. And yet everybody, from the most traditional kind of visitor to the most astute and contemporary thinking visitor, somehow now can seize contemporary imagery and use that to drop into the complexities of understanding historically. And then it doesn't mean that you can't, you know, that you can't look at the art historical crisis that Dada and Surrealism created without having it be in a tension-free display. And you can understand and absorb the meaning of that shift and of that break. But you do it also with a sense of continuum and thinking that, you know, in an odd way that happened in another time, in another place.
Right.
And that, having the encyclopedic depth allows you to do that.
Have you ever felt in your institution, because you do have such an enormous sweep of time, and you are, I mean, you do work in one of the most overdetermined places on the planet. Have you ever felt the, I don't mean to be the first person to tell you that.
Yes, but I just want to tell you there's a difference between that and our 20 acres of the State
Right.
of the Israel Museum.
So, do you find yourself or your curatorial staff needing to articulate different sets of criteria for the art of our time in terms of acquisition and exhibition, as opposed to the art of the, you know, the sort of modern and pre-modern periods?
Interestingly, no, and it's funny. It's that all that history gives you segues for explicating contemporary work where you might see disjunction from one kind to another,
Right.
and from one moment to another. It really actually opens up an opportunity for having things connect. You know, it's very remarkable to be in such a traditional place as Jerusalem and have the third of our audience that's really very traditional come in and look at very contemporary work. They're not startled by it. They don't take religious objection to it. It's really very amazing.
And do you think...
And I'm not on drugs.
At the moment, I actually am. So, do you think that there's something about the installation of this continuity, this sort of art historical continuity, if you will, that is allowing traditional audiences to have an encounter with the new that is not a hostile one?
Yes, actually, yes. And I will say, Most definitely yes, because it just gives you breathing space. And you know, I used to weigh more and have dark hair, but in the course of getting these galleries to be 1/3 as dense as they used to be, this was a challenge with a lot of your colleagues, with whom we are still close friends. But it does create the ability for any mindset to get its arms around work that is unfamiliar, alien, and possibly, on first glance, seemingly objectionable.
So maybe I'll just ask one last question and we can open it up to the audience. What then, how would you describe the role of art history in your museum as a scholarly discipline and practice?
I described 3 curatorial wings that are object-based: archaeology, Jewish world culture, fine arts, which divides Western, non-Western. We actually have as a 4th and equal curatorial wing education. And we have the best art school in Israel. We teach 100,000 kids. We train 7,000 teachers who don't get training in studio art and art history in their schools, and we cover all the communities. I know it sort of sounds a little utopian. So that we have the demographics of Israel. We have Israeli Jews, sacred and secular. We have Christians. We have Muslims. And we teach all of them, and we teach them from their foundation to a common appreciation of art history. It's extremely important for us. So we kind of nurture this 100,000 kids, who are 10% of all the kids in Israel, on an appreciation for the connected narrative of art history. And that allows them to deal with the past. And that might be what makes it easier for them to think about the present.
Right, right.
It's critically important.
Thank you. So there's so many of you in the audience, I don't want to hog the field of question asking. If anyone feels like they want to go to the mic and ask a question. A room full of silent curators. I do not understand what is happening. Yes.
I'm not going to walk over to the microphone, but I'm really encouraged by the conversation about talking about art history in the context of the contemporary, because it seems, in a sense, that a lot of the installations of contemporary art that I'm seeing lately are more about just making art familiar and really not talking about history at all and the place of the contemporary within the trajectory of art history. So it's very interesting to hear this point of view.
Just